Welcome to Lost at Sea Tales, where we dive into the haunting stories of ships, sailors, and voyages swallowed by the vast, unforgiving ocean. Each tale uncovers mystery, tragedy, and survival against the endless deep. Settle in as we journey into the chilling history of those forever lost at sea. Today we are exploring the tragedy of the levee failure in New Orleans due to Hurricane Katrina. Let's get into it. Part I, the storm awakens. The Atlantic was calm that August, as it had been for countless mornings. Fishermen sailed cautiously in small boats, nets trailing behind them, scanning the horizon. Satellites spun silently above, capturing the endless motion of clouds and currents. And meteorologists at the National Hurricane Center monitored screens filled with lines, numbers, and colored maps. One particular cluster of clouds, and remarkable at first, caught the eye of a young meteorologist named Laura Henderson. "It's nothing yet," she muttered, tracing the swirl of clouds with her finger. "But it's organizing faster than normal." Her colleague, a grizzled veteran named Jim, leaned over her shoulder. His face was lined from decades of storms and hurricanes that had never been catastrophic at least not on this scale. "Could be trouble," he said quietly. "Watch it." The storm had formed east of the Bahamas on August 23, 2005. A minor tropical depression that drifted lazily, feeding on the warm waters of the Atlantic. Its winds were weak, its presence easily ignored. But storms have a way of growing in secret, and this one was growing fast. By the evening of August 24th, the depression had strengthened. It became Tropical Storm Katrina. The name seemed innocuous, almost serenade, till the first satellite images showed the storm's structure sharpening, its spiral tightening. Atmospheric pressure was dropping. Wind speeds were climbing. Something about Katrina felt hungry. In South Florida, residents watched weather reports with mild interest. Many had seen storms before: Betsy in the 1960s, Andrew in the 1990s. Storms were part of life here. Families bought plywood, filled sandbags, and stocked up on bottled water. But few realized the true danger. A young father named Marcus leaned over his kitchen counter, listening to the TV. He had 2 children, ages 4 and 6, and a wife named Danielle. "It's just another storm," he said, trying to reassure himself. Danielle wasn't convinced. "It feels different," she said. "Look at it. It's moving fast, and it's huge." Marcus nodded, but said nothing. He wanted to believe her fear was just anxiety. By August 25th, Katrina made landfall in South Florida as a Category 1 hurricane. It tore through streets with winds exceeding 80 miles per hour. Trees fell, power went out. Rain poured in sheets. Some neighborhoods were flooded, cars were swept away, and lives were lost. But to most people, the storm was inconvenient, not catastrophic. Meteorologists watched, their unease growing. Katrina had survived Florida, and now it was entering the Gulf of Mexico, a body of water unusually warm that year. Almost like fuel poured onto a fire, the Gulf the storm began to feed. It gained strength hour by hour. By August 27th, Katrina had become a Category 3 hurricane. Winds surpassed 120 miles per hour. Its spiral stretched hundreds of miles across the Gulf. At the National Hurricane Center in Miami, Laura Henderson and Jim were glued to the radar. "It's gaining energy faster than I've ever seen," Laura said, her finger tracing the bright red eye that had formed. "Look at that symmetry. It's beautiful, but it's terrifying." Jim shook his head. "This is the kind of storm that breaks records," he muttered. "If it heads toward New Orleans, people need to know it's not just another hurricane. It's the big one." Meanwhile, in New Orleans, life carried on as usual. The streets buzzed with music. The smell of fried food filled the air, and the riverboats steamed down the Mississippi. Families went about their lives, some unaware that the city was sitting in a precarious bowl of land, most of it below sea level, protected only by Levees-made walls of earth and concrete. Among them was a young nurse named Simone, working her night shift at Charity Hospital. She had grown up hearing stories about hurricanes, but had never seen one strong enough to worry her. As she prepared for her shift, she heard the faint hum of weather warnings on the radio. Tropical Storm Katrina is expected to strengthen over the Gulf. Residents in low-lying areas should monitor local advisories. She frowned. Something in the tone of the announcer made her pause. There was an urgency in the voice that didn't sound routine. Back in the Gulf, Katrina was no longer content with gradual strengthening. By August 28th, she had become a Category 5 hurricane. Her winds screamed past 170 miles per hour. The eye, now nearly 30 miles wide, looked serene from above, a perfect circle of calm in the storm's center. But from the ground, the winds were hell. The sea itself seemed to rise, ready to consume anything in its path. Warnings went out across the Gulf Coast, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. Evacuations were ordered. Shelters opened. Families scrambled to leave. Marcus and Danielle packed the car. Simone made calls to her colleagues at the hospital, preparing for patients who would be stranded. And in New Orleans, the city braced itself. At night, the sky over Lake Pontchartrain turned a bruised purple. Winds swept through the streets. People shuttered their windows, tied down whatever they could, and prayed. For some, it was the first time they felt true fear, survivor voice later account. I had never been so scared in my life. The wind sounded like it was tearing the city apart. I held my kids close and just prayed it would pass. As part 1 closes, Katrina loomed over the Gulf, a growing monster, with the city of New Orleans in her path. No one yet understood the full scale of what was coming: the wind, storm surge, and the levee failures that would drown an entire city. Part 2, approaching doom, the morning of August 26th, dawned hot and humid across New Orleans. The city's streets were alive with the usual chaos: honking cars, vendors setting up for the day, children laughing on stoops. But beneath the ordinary, a tension hummed. Radios and televisions repeated the warnings over and over. Katrina had grown into a Category 4 hurricane. Its winds had reached 145 miles per hour, and forecasters warned that it was moving steadily toward Louisiana. In a modest apartment in the lower 9th Ward, the Thomas family huddled around a flickering television. Marcus and Danielle Thomas had spent hours packing. Their 2 children clutched stuffed animals while their grandmother, frail but determined, insisted on bringing photographs and heirlooms. "We can't take it all," Danielle said, wringing her hands. "We'll have to leave most of it behind. Better to leave it than lose ourselves," Marcus replied, voice tight with tension. Outside, neighbors were boarding up windows with plywood. Children ran through the streets, screaming, playing as if the world were normal. No one yet understood how fragile that illusion was. Farther uptown, Simone prepared for what she feared would be a nightmare shift at Charity Hospital. Nurses and doctors were reporting early. Patients who could be moved were being transferred or sent home. The hospital's emergency generators were tested, supplies stacked in anticipation. "This is going to be worse than anything we've seen," Simone whispered to a colleague who simply nodded, eyes wide. Meanwhile, highways out of the city were already congested. Cars packed with families, dogs, cats, and entire households crawled northward. Gas stations ran low, tempers flared, and tempers frayed under the August heat. Some drivers honked endlessly, frustrated with the pace, while others prayed silently. Survivor voice highway evacuee. "We were stuck for hours. Kids crying, dogs barking. Everyone was tense. You could feel it in the air. Nobody spoke much. We all knew something terrible was coming." In the French Quarter, tourists were confused. Some ignored the warnings, assuming they were overblown. Bars were still open. Street performers entertained passersby, but locals hurried to secure businesses and homes. Shutters were nailed, signs removed, and boats readied along the canals. Meteorologists at the National Hurricane Center monitored Katrina's path obsessively. Laura Henderson and Jim worked around the clock, updating models, issuing warnings, and coordinating with state authorities. Every new satellite image showed the storm growing larger and more symmetrical. It was a perfect spiral, deadly in its precision. "It's bigger than we thought," Laura said, voice tense. "It's aiming right for New Orleans, and it's gaining speed," Jim added. "If it doesn't shift, we could be looking at complete devastation across the city." Families debated whether to stay or leave. Some had no choice: no car, no money for hotels, no family outside the city. Others stayed out of pride, stubbornness, or disbelief. In the lower 9th Ward, the Thomases reluctantly decided to leave. Their neighbors, the Rodriguezes, refused. Mr. Rodriguez, a retired dock worker, shook his head as his neighbors packed into cars. "I've lived here 60 years, he said. "I've seen worse than this. This city has survived storms before, and will survive this one too." By late afternoon, the first bands of Katrina's outer winds had reached New Orleans. Trees swayed violently. Windows rattled. Power flickered, and then went out in some neighborhoods. Rain began to fall, thin at first, then heavier as evening approached. Survivor voiced lower Ninth Ward resident. The wind started howling like a freight train. Rain was sideways, but we didn't sleep that night. None of us could. In the uptown area, Simone and her colleagues at Charity Hospital worked tirelessly, checking emergency equipment and preparing for the inevitable influx of patients. The city's levees, which had protected New Orleans for decades, were being scrutinized, but no one yet feared the catastrophic failures to come. By nightfall, Katrina's approach was unmistakable. Lightning lit the sky. Thunder rattled buildings. Rain pounded rooftops. The city, tense and unsettled, braced for the worst. Across the Mississippi Gulf Coast, residents were already experiencing the storm's wrath. Entire towns were flooded. Casinos, homes, and infrastructure were destroyed. Families huddled in attics or on rooftops as the surge tore inland. News of destruction traveled slowly, heightening tension in New Orleans. Survivor voiced Mississippi resident, "We thought we were safe in the attic. The water kept rising. My husband held the kids. The whole house shook. I never thought I'd see this." As the night of August 28th fell over New Orleans, as the city felt small against the enormity of Katrina. Streets were quieter than usual, punctuated by the sounds of wind, rain, and anxious conversations. Families double-checked supplies, radios crackled with warnings, dogs whimpered, sensing the storm's fury. In the darkness, Marcus and Danielle held their children close, their car packed and ready. Simone sat in the hospital, listening to the rain drum against the roof, mentally preparing for the chaos to come. And in the Gulf, Katrina continued to grow, feeding on the warmth of the water, her eye now a terrifying 30-mile-wide vortex. No one yet knew that within hours the storm would strike, the levees would fail, New Orleans would face a catastrophe unlike any in its history. Part 3. The Eye of Terror, the first light of dawn on August 29, 2005. Revealed a sky bruised and swollen with dark clouds. Over the Gulf Coast, Katrina's monstrous eye approached with terrifying precision. Winds had surpassed 170 miles per hour. The storm surge, now over 20 feet in some areas, pushed relentlessly toward the city. In New Orleans, a tense quiet hung in the air. Marcus and Danielle Thomas, their two children strapped into the back seat, sat in bumper-to-bumper traffic, crawling northward along the interstate. The air smelled of rain and ozone, the tension in the car nearly tangible. "Do you think we'll make it?" Danielle whispered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "We'll make it," Marcus replied, though he could barely convince himself. Farther south, Simone prepared for the worst at Charity Hospital. The rain was now a constant roar against the windows. Winds rattled the structure, sending shivers down her spine. She moved among patients who had been unable to evacuate, checking monitors and ensuring the emergency generators were ready. "We're going to be busy," she muttered to herself. And this is just the beginning. Across the Mississippi Gulf Coast, the destruction had already begun. In Biloxi, entire neighborhoods were flattened. Wooden homes were ripped from their foundations and swept into the bay. Cars floated past like driftwood. Families clung to rooftops, terrified, waiting for the water to stop its relentless climb. Survivor voiced Mississippi resident. "We held on to each other. The water was over my waist in minutes. My neighbor's house went floating by. Couldn't believe it. Thought we'd die that morning," as Katrina made landfall near the Louisiana-Mississippi border. New Orleans braced for impact. Winds howled like freight trains. Rain pelted rooftops with such force it sounded like gunfire. The river's water, already unnaturally high, began to surge into the city's canals. Survivor voiced Lakeview resident. "It sounded like the sky was falling. I've never heard anything like it. Windows shattered in my house. Water started seeping under doors. We ran upstairs, carrying what we could. On the streets, chaos began to unfold. Power lines snapped, sending sparks into the rising water. Trees fell across roadways. Debris flew through the air like missiles. Emergency responders struggled to move against the wind, their vehicles barely staying upright. The lower Ninth Ward, the Thomas family had returned home for a moment to check on property they could not take. Marcus clutched Danielle and their children as the house trembled under the force of the wind. The water was beginning to rise in the streets, black and full of debris. "Have to get out now," Danielle shouted. But escape routes were already submerged. The family retreated to the attic, pulling up ladders and whatever they could find to stay above the rising floodwaters. Survivor voice, lower Ninth Ward. I looked out the window and saw my neighbor's house just floating past us. And then another. It was like the world had turned upside down. Meanwhile, over Lake Pontchartrain, the water surged violently against the city's levees. Engineers monitoring the canals could see stress points forming in the walls. In some areas, water began to seep through cracks in the levees, undermining the soil beneath them. Nobody knew it yet, but within hours, these weak points would become catastrophic failures. The storms I approached. Inside that eerie calm, wind briefly subsided, but the silence was deceptive. Birds had fled, street sounds had disappeared. Even the water seemed to pause for a moment, waiting. Then, the second half of the storm hit. Katrina's winds shifted violently, now coming from the opposite direction. The rain intensified. Streets turned into rivers in seconds. Homes that had survived the first pass were now battered and flooded. A survivor voice, uptown resident. The water came up so fast, we had 10 seconds to grab what we could. The current was like a river ripping through the street. I couldn't see my feet. I couldn't see my neighbor. Everything was gone. In the hours that followed, Katrina's fury escalated. The Mississippi coast and New Orleans faced sustained winds over 150 miles per hour. Trees were uprooted, power lines fell, and roofs peeled from homes like paper. Storm surge reached previously unimaginable levels, flowing into canals and bayous. Residents clung to their homes, their rooftops, their attics. Some tried to paddle through water in small boats. Others found themselves stranded on cars or debris, unsure if they would be rescued. Survivor voice, attic resident. We were trapped. The water kept rising. We could hear the storm tearing everything apart outside. And yet, somehow, we had to survive. We had no choice. By midday, the first reports of levee failures began to trickle in. In the lower Ninth Ward, a flood wall on the industrial canal had collapsed. A torrent of water surged into the neighborhood, sweeping away homes and vehicles. Panic spread as families realized that the protective walls they had trusted for generations were failing. In Lakeview, residents watched in horror as streets became rivers, carrying entire homes and cars past their windows. Survivor voice, Lakeview resident. I couldn't believe it. My street was gone. Everything I knew about my neighborhood was underwater. Yes, people were screaming for help. Some we never saw again. Katrina's landfall had turned the city into a battlefield against nature. And yet, this was only the beginning. The levees, already compromised, would fail in more places, turning the city into a drowned labyrinth. Part 4. The levees break by the morning of August 29, 2005. New Orleans was already battered by Katrina's relentless winds and rain. Trees had fallen, power lines were down, and streets were submerged in ankle to waist-deep water. Yet for most residents, the levees were still a symbol of safety, a barrier against the surrounding waters. That illusion would not last. At the industrial canal, the water had risen to unprecedented levels. Engineers monitoring the levee from nearby control rooms noticed cracks forming under pressure. The stress points widened as the surge pushed higher, testing the limits of a system that had long been criticized for poor design and insufficient maintenance. And then, at approximately 8 a.m., the wall failed. A massive torrent of water exploded into the lower Ninth Ward. Streets vanished beneath a churning black river. Homes were lifted from their foundations and carried away like toys. Families scrambled to rooftops, attics, and anything that floated. Survivor voice, lower Ninth Ward resident. I opened my front door, and it was gone. My neighbors' houses were floating past us. We ran to the attic with whatever we could grab. Water was already waist deep, and it didn't stop. It just kept coming. Across the city, the 17th Street Canal failed. A 100-foot section of flood wall gave way, sending a torrent into the heart of New Orleans. The water poured into neighborhoods that had been spared the first surge. Cars flipped, trees snapped. People clung to anything they could find. Survivor voice, Lakeview resident. I grabbed my little brother and ran. Water was up to my chest in seconds. I could see my neighbors floating away on debris. They were screaming everywhere. I thought we'd never make it. The London Avenue Canal followed. 2 more massive breaches sent additional surges of water into the city. By midday, it was estimated that 80% of New Orleans was underwater. The city, once vibrant with music, food, and culture, had become a labyrinth of black moving water. Streetlights flickered were gone entirely on. Rooftops were the only places left for refuge. Survivor voice attic resident, later account. We climbed into the attic with my children. The water was already up to the first floor. We could hear houses collapsing next door. The wind was screaming. Didn't think we'd survive the day. Emergency responders tried to navigate the chaos. Rescue boats moved through streets that had become rivers. But the scale of the disaster was overwhelming. Helicopters hovered overhead, dropping lines to stranded families. Many were too far inland or trapped on rooftops that were surrounded by debris. In the lower 9th Ward, the Thomas family huddled on their attic floor. Marcus held their children close, listening to the roar of water as it tore through their neighborhood. Danielle tried to remain calm, but her voice trembled. I can't see anything, she whispered. I don't know if we're the only ones left. We'll get through this, Marcus said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Survivor voice neighbor on rooftop. I looked down and saw the street was gone. Cars were floating past me. One neighbor's entire house floated by like it was made of cardboard. People were screaming, crying, yelling for help. Now I just held my dog and prayed. The water was not just a physical threat, it was toxic. Sewage from flooded pipes, oil from overturned cars, and chemicals from damaged industrial areas mixed into a deadly stew. The smell was unbearable. Cuts and bruises from debris risked infection, Survivor voice medical volunteer later recalled. We were pulling people off rooftops. Some were cut, some were hypothermic. The water smelled like rot and chemicals. I can still remember the taste in my mouth when I swallowed some by accident throughout the day. More neighborhoods succumbed. Lower-income areas where evacuation had been impossible for many were especially devastated. Families were forced to improvise, floating on doors, makeshift rafts, or clinging to trees. The city had turned into a drowning maze. Every corner, every street was a risk. Lives were being swept away in minutes, while cries for help echoed through the flooded neighborhoods. Survivor voice teenager trapped on rooftop. I was with my little brother. The water kept rising. I had to hold him above the water. Houses floated past us. People screamed, and the current tried to take him from me. I prayed we'd make it until someone came. By late afternoon, helicopters and rescue boats had rescued hundreds, but thousands remained stranded. Some clung to rooftops for days. Others tried to navigate the floodwaters with debris or anything that floated, often facing hidden currents, submerged obstacles, and contaminated water. The levee failures weren't just engineering disasters, they were death sentences for thousands, leaving families stranded in a city that was no longer navigable by streets. Survivor voice family rescued after 2 days on rooftop. We couldn't believe how long we were stuck. You'd think it would recede, but it didn't. We watched neighbors swept away. We prayed we'd survive the night. And the next day, and the next. As night fell over the flooded city, New Orleans was unrecognizable. Streets were rivers, homes were floating debris, and rooftops were islands of hope. The storm had passed, but the flooding caused by failing levees was only beginning. For those trapped, the night was endless. Darkness concealed dangers in every corner. The roar of the water drowned cries for help, and for some, there was no escape. Part the fifth, trapped in fighting night, descended over New Orleans, but the darkness brought no relief. Instead, it revealed the true scope of the catastrophe. The storm had passed, but the waters had not receded. They rose and rose, fed by the broken levees and canals that bled the city dry. By now, 80% of New Orleans lay submerged, with entire neighborhoods swallowed. The silence was eerie, punctuated only by cries for help. The barking of stranded dogs and the distant hum of helicopters cutting through the night sky. 1. Rooftops and attics in the lower Ninth Ward, the Thomas family huddled in their attic. The heat was unbearable, stifling, as the floodwater rose below. They had drilled a hole in the roof with a kitchen knife and a hammer, desperate for air. The children whimpered in exhaustion, clutching at their parents. Marcus pressed his ear against the shingles, listening. The night was alive with sound screams carried across the water. Houses groaned as they shifted on their foundations, and now and then, something large crashed against their home with a terrible thud. "We have to get onto the roof," Danielle whispered, her face pale in the dim glow of a flashlight. They climbed through the opening they had cut. The rooftop was slick, angled dangerously, but it was the only refuge left. From there, the view was apocalyptic. Water stretched as far as the eye could see. Streetlights flickered beneath the surface. Cars bobbed like toys, tire houses floated by. And everywhere, voices called out into the night. "Help, over here. Somebody please," but no help came. Not yet. Survivor voice attic escapee. "We were in that attic for hours. It got so hot we could barely breathe. I thought my kids would suffocate before the water even got us. When we finally got onto the roof, the air hit my face, and I just cried. We weren't safe, but at least we could breathe." 2. The Superdome elsewhere. Thousands had sought shelter in the Louisiana Superdome. The massive stadium, usually filled with the roar of Saints fans, was now a cavern of despair. Nearly 30,000 people packed inside, most with only the clothes on their backs. At first there was a strange sense of relief. The dome had survived the storm's winds. People huddled together, sharing food, stories, and reassurances that help would arrive soon. But as hours turned into days, the reality sank in. The air conditioning had failed. Toilets overflowed. Food and water supplies dwindled. The heat was suffocating, the stench overwhelming. Children cried from hunger. The elderly collapsed from dehydration. Fear spread faster than any relief. Survivor voice Superdome resident, "It was like a prison, dark, hot, filthy. You couldn't sleep because of the noise or the smell. You couldn't eat because there wasn't enough. All the while you kept wondering, did anyone even know we were in here?" 3. The convention center at the Ernest N. Morial Convention Center conditions were even worse. Thousands who couldn't reach the Superdome gathered there, expecting supplies and relief. None came. There was no electricity, no running water, no security. Families clustered in corners, whispering prayers. Bodies of those who hadn't made it were wrapped in sheets or covered with tarps. Rumors spread like wildfire. Looters, gangs, disease. The tension was unbearable. Survivor Voice Convention Center. It was like being abandoned by the world. Kept waiting for someone to show up with food, with water, with buses, but no one came. Not for days. 4. Rescuers and boats, while chaos grew in the shelters. Rescuers and boats and helicopters scoured the flooded neighborhoods. The Coast Guard pulled survivors from rooftops by the dozens. Volunteers, ordinary citizens with small boats later, called the Cajun Navy, joined the effort, risking their lives to save strangers. But for every life saved, dozens more remained trapped. The city was too big, the flooding too vast. Survivor voice rescued from rooftop. "When that boat came around the corner, I thought I was dreaming. I'd been on that roof for 2 days with no food, no water, just the sun beating down on me. When they reached out their hand, I felt like God himself had sent them." 5. Stranded and fighting to survive for those still trapped. Survival meant improvisation. Some broke into stores, not for greed, but for food and water. Others fashioned rafts from doors or mattresses. Neighbors helped each other climb onto higher ground, while some families tied themselves together with ropes so the current wouldn't tear them apart. Survivor voice Lower Ninth Ward. "I saw a man break into a grocery store and come out with baby formula. He gave it to a mother holding her child on a roof. People said looters, but no, he was saving lives." 6. The weight of time. As hours turned into days, exhaustion took hold. Some rooftops became tombs. People died waiting for rescue, for food, for hope. The water was still, yet deadly. Bodies floated alongside debris. The stench grew unbearable. Heat baked those exposed, while mosquitoes swarmed without mercy. The city was no longer alive. It was enduring. survivor-voiced teenager at the Superdome. I kept thinking, where's the army? Where's the president? Where's anyone? We're just sitting there in hell, waiting to die or be saved. By the 5th day, the world finally saw what had happened in New Orleans. News crews broadcast images of the stranded, the desperate, the dead. Public outrage exploded. Rescue efforts ramped up, but for many, the suffering had already gone too far. Narrator's reflection. New Orleans was not just fighting water. It was fighting abandonment, hunger, heat, disease, and despair. The storm had passed, but the human battle had only begun. Part the 6th. The longest days the storm had passed. The waters had risen. The levees had failed. Now came the waiting. Days blurred together in the drowned city, each one hotter, harder, and heavier than the last. The hurricane had been merciless, but its aftermath was worse, a slow, grinding assault on the spirit of New Orleans. 1. The sun beating down. The first day after the storm's fury, survivors awoke to a blazing sun. With the storm clouds gone, there was nothing to shield them from the relentless Louisiana heat. Rooftops turned into frying pans. Asphalt shimmered beneath the standing water. Those stranded without shade baked under the sun, lips cracked, eyes burning. Many had no water, no food, nothing but the will to endure another hour. Survivor voice rooftop. Day 2. It wasn't the storm that broke MIT, was the sun. You'd think after the wind and the rain we'd get a break. But no. The sun was worse. You couldn't breathe. You couldn't think. You just burned. 2. Water. Water everywhere, but none to drink. The irony was cruel. The city was drowning in water, yet clean drinking water was nowhere to be found. The flood carried sewage, oil, and chemicals. People grew delirious with thirst, some sipping from bottles they'd found floating in the muck. Others risking a mouthful of the black water despite the sickness it brought. Mothers rationed baby formula, mixing it thinner than it should be to make it last another day. Neighbors passed water bottles from rooftop to rooftop with broom handles and fishing nets. Survivor Voice Convention Center. We watched the kids cry themselves to sleep because they were thirsty. Nothing is worse than seeing a child beg for water and having nothing to give them. 3. Hunger and desperation. Food vanished quickly. Those who had prepared lost much of it to the flood. Shelters had almost nothing. Hunger gnawed at the people. Some broke into grocery stores, not for greed, but survival. Cans of soup, bread, crackers, cereal, anything was a blessing. In the Superdome, people tore open vending machines. At the convention center, small groups cooked scavenged food over makeshift fires. Survivor Voice Superdome. You stopped caring about pride. You found something, anything, you shared it. One night, someone brought crackers. They broke them into pieces and gave them to the kids. We all just watched those kids eat. That was enough for us. For the smell of death by the 3rd day, the stench became impossible to ignore. The floodwater carried everything with it: garbage, sewage, chemicals, and the dead. Some bodies floated in the streets, trapped in trees, or slumped against rooftops. People tried to cover their noses with shirts, towels, or anything at hand. But the smell of rot clung to the air, a constant reminder of how many had not survived. Survivor Voice Medical Volunteer. The smell hit you first, sweet, sick, heavy. You knew what it was before you even saw them. Then you did see them and you couldn't unsee it. 5. The sound of waiting. The silence was never complete. There was always noise, but it was the wrong kind of noise. Helicopters thumped overhead, distant and teasing. Boats splashed through the streets, but often too far away. Dogs barked endlessly, hungry and frightened. Babies cried until they had no strength left. And then there were the voices, the constant shouting, the calls for help that went unanswered. Over here, we need water. Somebody please. Each voice carried across the water, a chorus of desperation that grew weaker with every passing day. 6. Shelters becoming prisons. The shelters, once seen as safe havens, became places of despair. At the Superdome, the toilets overflowed, creating rivers of sewage. The air was thick, unbreathable. People fainted from the heat. Violence broke out in the shadows, fights over food, over space, over fear. At the convention center, thousands sat in the dark, waiting for buses that never came. Bodies lay under sheets in plain sight. Parents covered their children's eyes. Survivor Voice Convention Center. You stopped asking when help would come. You just asked if it would come at all. 7. Small acts of heroism amid the despair. There were moments of light. Neighbors carried strangers on makeshift rafts. Families shared their last bottles of water. Strangers held babies to give exhausted mothers rest. Musicians played battered instruments in the Superdome to distract the children. Survivor Voice rescued child. There was this old man with a trumpet. He played while we sat there in the dark. For a little while, it felt like we weren't in hell anymore. It felt like New Orleans again. 8. The slow arrival of help. By the 4th and 5th days, the federal response finally began to arrive in force. National Guard trucks rolled in. Helicopters lowered baskets. Convoys brought food and water. But for many, it was too late. Dehydration, illness, and exhaustion had already taken lives. Survivors watched the soldiers with a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that someone was finally there. Anger that it had taken so long. Survivor Voice Lakeview resident. When I saw the guard come in, I cried. I wasn't even ashamed. But I also thought, why now? Where were you when we were screaming for days? 9. The longest days for New Orleans, those 5 days after Katrina, were not measured in hours, but in breaths, in sips of water, in moments of endurance. Each day stretched like an eternity. Each night was a battle against fear and the unknown. The city had survived the storm, but it had not survived unscathed. It was bruised, broken, and abandoned. Yet even in the darkest days, its people clung to life, to one another, and to the hope that help would finally come. Part 7, Aftermath. The water did not disappear all at once. It lingered, heavy and stagnant, for weeks. Slowly, almost grudgingly, it drained away through the ruined levees and canals, leaving behind a landscape that no longer resembled New Orleans. The storm had destroyed in hours what it had taken generations to build. But it was only when the waters began to recede that survivors could finally see what Katrina had left behind. 1. Streets of ruin. The familiar streets of the city were unrecognizable. Cars were stacked on top of one another, crumpled like toys. Boats sat marooned on lawns, miles from the nearest water. Homes were gutted, walls smeared with the black line of the flood's high water mark. The smell of mold, sewage, and death clung to every surface. In some neighborhoods, entire blocks had been erased. Where houses once stood, there were only foundations, piles of lumber, and silence. Survivor Voice Lower 9th Ward. It looked like a bomb had gone off. My street wasn't my street anymore. The houses were gone, the people were gone. Everything I knew had just disappeared. 2. Searching for the missing families searched desperately for loved ones. Bulletin boards appeared at shelters and relief stations, covered in handwritten notes. Have you seen my brother? Looking for my mother? Missing 4-year-old girl, last seen on Claiborne Avenue. People scoured hospitals, relief camps, and shelters. Some searched the ruins of their own neighborhoods, calling out names into the silence, hoping for an answer that never came. Survivor Voice woman searching. I kept walking down the street, calling for my husband. I knew he was gone, but I had to hear something. Anything. I never did. 3 reunions and loss. There were moments of joy. Families reunited after days or weeks of separation. Mothers finding children. Brothers embracing after fearing the worst. But there were also moments of crushing loss. For every reunion, there was another story of someone who never returned. Morgues filled with bodies recovered from attics, rooftops, and the floodwaters themselves. Survivor Voice rescue worker. We pulled them out one by one, sometimes whole families together. We had to keep going, but every face stays with you. For the return of power and order, as the water receded, the National Guard and federal agencies established stronger control. Convoys of supplies arrived. Temporary hospitals were set up. Relief camps swelled with displaced families. Soldiers patrolled streets that had once been full of jazz and life, now silent but for their boots in the mud. The sight of uniforms brought mixed emotions, safety for some, bitterness for others who asked why it had taken so long. Survivor Voice Superdome evacuee. When the buses came, I almost didn't believe it. We'd been waiting for so long, it felt like a dream. But then I saw we weren't going home. We were leaving home. 5. exile and displacement. Tens of thousands of New Orleanians were bussed out of the city, many with no idea where they were going. Families were taken to Houston, Atlanta, Baton Rouge, even as far as Utah and Colorado. For some, the exile was temporary. For others, it became permanent. Entire communities were scattered across the country, their neighborhoods gone, their homes unlivable. Survivor Voice New Orleans resident, displaced to Texas. I thought we'd be gone for a week, maybe 2. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. Some of us never went back. 6. The long shadow of grief, the official death toll, would eventually surpass 1,800 people. But the true number of lives broken was far higher. Survivors carried trauma that could not be measured. Children woke in the night screaming. Parents grieved quietly, carrying guilt for the rest of their lives. Churches filled with mourners. Funerals were held in clusters because so many had died at once. Graves could not hold the grief. Survivor Voice Pastor. Every face I buried was a story, a song, a life. My city became a cemetery. 7. Glimmers of resilience. Yet amid the grief, there was resilience. Musicians played on street corners as soon as they could, their instruments salvaged from the wreckage. Families returned to ruined homes with shovels and buckets, determined to clean and rebuild. Restaurants reopened on skeleton crews, serving red beans and rice on paper plates. New Orleans was wounded but not dead. Its heartbeat was faint, but still present in the laughter of children playing among debris. In the rhythm of jazz echoing through half-empty streets, in the stubborn pride of those who refused to leave. Survivor Voice Musician. The water took my house, my car, my everything. But it couldn't take my music. As long as I can play, New Orleans lives. 8. The questions left behind. As the city began to emerge from the flood, questions filled the air. Why had the levees failed so catastrophically? Why had help taken so long to arrive? Who was responsible for the suffering, the abandonment, the loss of life? Anger simmered alongside grief. Investigations began. Accusations flew from local government to state to federal. The Army Corps of Engineers eventually admitted to design flaws in the levee system. But for the people of New Orleans, no admission could bring back the dead. 9. The city that would never be the same by the end of September. Much of the water had drained, but the scars were permanent. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Tens of thousands were displaced. Businesses shuttered. Schools closed. The city would rebuild, slowly, painfully. But it would never be the same. New Orleans had been drowned. And though it would rise again, it would forever carry the memory of the days when the water came and the levees broke. Part 8. Reflection and lessons the waters receded. The dead were counted. Survivors began the long process of rebuilding lives from fragments. But Katrina was not just a storm, it was a reckoning. Exposed weaknesses in levees, in emergency planning, in leadership, in compassion. It tested the people of New Orleans, and it scarred them. Yet, it also revealed extraordinary resilience, a determination to rise from the ruins, even when the world seemed to turn its back. 1. The failures laid bare. Investigations revealed that the levees' supposed guardians of the city were flawed by design. Corners had been cut, warnings ignored. The Army Corps of Engineers would later admit responsibility. The flood protection system was a system in name only, riddled with weaknesses. For the people who had lost everything, this admission felt hollow. It was not just the storm that had drowned their homes, it was neglect, bureaucracy, and failure. And then there was the response. The world had watched New Orleans suffer for days, with helicopters flying overhead while families waved from rooftops below. Images of the Superdome and the convention center shocked the nation. Americans abandoned in their own city. The storm revealed not only natural vulnerability, but human vulnerability flaws in race, class, and poverty that made evacuation and survival impossible for thousands. Survivor Voice Elderly Resident. It wasn't the storm that betrayed us, it was the people who were supposed to protect us. 2. The spirit that endured, but Katrina also revealed something stronger. The spirit of New Orleans. Neighbors risked their lives to save strangers. Volunteers in fishing boats, the Cajun Navy, pulled hundreds from rooftops. Families shared the last of their food with children who weren't their own. Musicians played in shelters to drown out despair, and when the waters fell, people came back. They shoveled mud from their homes. They painted over mold. They rebuilt brick by brick, note by note, gumbo pot by gumbo pot. Survivor voice musician, we don't just live in New Orleans. We belong to it, and it belongs to us. If it falls, we rise it back up. 3. The long road of recovery was slow. Years passed before some neighborhoods saw signs of life again. Some never did. Tens of thousands never returned, scattered across the United States, building new lives in Houston, Atlanta, Baton Rouge, and beyond. They carried New Orleans in their hearts, but their streets, their churches, their schools, their sense of home were gone forever. Still, those who remained fought to revive their city. They reopened bars and restaurants, and restored Mardi Gras parades. They lifted brass horns and played music that told the world New Orleans was still alive. 4. Lessons etched in water. Katrina left lessons etched not in stone, but in waterline stained on every building. Infrastructure must be built for reality, not hope. Disaster planning must not abandon the poor, the elderly, the vulnerable. Response must be swift, coordinated, and humane. And above all, resilience is not born from government, it is born from people. 5. The memory that lingers today, 2 decades later, Katrina is not just a memory, it is a shadow. Survivors still wake to nightmares of water rising, of screams in the dark, of nights without food or hope. Children who were carried on rooftops are now adults, carrying scars no one can see. And yet life returned. Jazz fills the air again. Mardi Gras crews parade through rebuilt streets. The smell of gumbo and beignets drifts through the French Quarter. The levees are stronger now, but the people are stronger still. Closing reflection, Katrina was more than a hurricane. It was a test of nature, of government, of humanity itself. It revealed how fragile we are and how strong we can be. The city drowned, but it did not die. New Orleans remains a place of music, resilience, and soul. A city scarred, yes, but also unbroken. Epilogue: when the levees broke, they let in more than water. They let in a reckoning, a reminder that safety is never guaranteed, that neglect has consequences, that disaster does not strike evenly. But they also revealed something else, that even in the darkest flood, the human spirit rises. And in New Orleans, the spirit still sings. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the mysteries of the sea. If you enjoyed this tale of shipwrecks, destruction, and survival, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a story from Lost at Sea Tales. Until next time, may the winds be steady, and may you never find yourself lost at sea.